Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into a world full of buzzing ideas, clunky contraptions, and people who changed history, and somehow got left behind by it. You ever flip a light switch and just expect it to work? Or plug in your phone and zone out while it charges? Yeah, same here. But here's the thing, somebody made that possible, and odds are, you've never heard his name. Before Edison lit up the world, or lit up the history books at least, another man beat him to it. He built a working light bulb. Years earlier, he filed the patent. He even set up factories. But in the end, he got stomped out, pushed aside, and mostly forgotten. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing how wide this bedtime crew really is. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Historians still argue whether this makes her the first programmer, since the machine itself was never built in her lifetime. But it's not just about the code, it's about the vision. Ada Lovelace imagined a world where machines could manipulate numbers, words, music, even art. She wrote that the machine might act upon other things besides number. The engine might compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent. That sounds a whole lot like the foundation of modern computing, from AI art to music production software. Yet, for decades, Ada was reduced to a side note. A clever girl who helped Babbage. Wrong. Babbage had the hardware. Ada imagined the software. Here's something weird. She was largely forgotten for over 100 years. Her notes gathered dust. Her ideas didn't influence the early days of computer science, not because they weren't good, but because nobody took the time to read them. And when the first real programmers were building machines in the mid-20th century, they had no idea she'd already mapped out the concept. It wasn't until the 1950s and 60s that Ada's work got rediscovered. Historians and computer scientists looked at her notes and went, wait, she did what in the 1840s? The US Department of Defense even named a programming language after her in the 1980s. Ada, which is nice, but a bit late. The thing is, Ada Lovelace wasn't just technically brilliant. She thought like a philosopher. She saw machines not as cold, number-crunching tools, but as creative instruments. That's what makes her legacy feel so modern. She wasn't asking what machines could do, she was asking what they might do. That's the kind of thinking that leads to smart speakers, digital music, and yes, even artificial intelligence. Yet somehow, when you hear people talk about the history of computers, they rattle off names like Turing, von Neumann, Gates, Jobs, rarely Ada. Even when people do bring her up, it often feels like a side dish to the main course. Oh, and Ada Lovelace was around too. No, Ada was the blueprint. The theory, the dreamer, who saw computing before it even had a body. It's quirky to think that someone who died in 1852 could have written the job description for your local software engineer, but that's the truth. Ada looked at a bunch of cogs and gears and imagined something deeper. Something that could express logic, beauty, even imagination. So next time someone calls a computer just a machine, remember Ada Lovelace, the poet's daughter, the programmer's mother, and the woman who saw the soul inside the circuit. Tonight, let's meet Vint Cerf, a guy often called the father of the internet, and yet somehow, most people have never heard of him. You'd think creating the digital nervous system of the entire planet would earn you some spotlight, right? But no, we all know Zuckerberg, Musk, Jobs, people who built things on the internet. Cerf helped build the internet itself. Back in the 1970s, Cerf and his colleague Bob Kahn were trying to solve a tricky problem: how to get computers from different networks to talk to each other. At the time, networks were like islands. Each one had its own rules, its own way of speaking. What Cerf and Kahn came up with was a new set of universal instructions, TCP/IP. Now those 4 letters might not mean much when you're scrolling Instagram or streaming a show, but they are literally what makes all of that possible. TCP/IP is what breaks your data into little packets, sends it flying across cables, satellites, or Wi-Fi, and then reassembles it at its destination. Every photo, every message, every voice note, it all rides on the tracks Cerf helped lay down. And yet, when was the last time you heard his name in a documentary, or saw him thanked at a tech conference? If you're into computers, maybe you've seen his iconic bow tie. But to the general public, he's invisible. Historians still debate how much credit should go to which pioneer, because there were a lot of people involved in building what we now call the internet. But Vint Cerf wasn't just a coder, he was a visionary. He didn't just figure out how to send data, he saw the future, a network that could grow endlessly, connect the entire globe, and still work at massive scale. And he didn't stop there. Cerf went on to help design protocols for interplanetary internet. Yeah, space internet. The guy who made your email possible is now working on how to get signals from Mars to Earth without dropping the call. But he's not a billionaire. He doesn't own a social media empire. He didn't slap his name on a flashy brand. He's just the guy who quietly made sure the system worked and kept working for everyone. Here's a quirky detail. Cerf is hard of hearing, and he's spoken publicly about how that experience helped shape his ideas about communication and accessibility. It makes sense someone who understands how fragile and precious connection is would want to build the most resilient, flexible system imaginable. And yet, we hand all the credit to whoever built the latest app. The people who ride the rails get more attention than the people who laid them. Every time you tap a link, load a website, or stream a sleepy bedtime history video, you're leaning on Cerf's invisible invention. It's like we all live in a house he built, but forgot to put his name on the deed. The internet didn't just appear one day. It wasn't dropped from the sky or dreamed up by a billionaire in a hoodie. It was built painstakingly, deliberately, by people like Vint Cerf, who believed in open access, strong foundations, and long-term thinking. So next time you log on, maybe say a quiet thank you to the man who made it all possible. And maybe, just maybe, remember that history isn't only shaped by the loudest voices. Sometimes it's built packet by people who understood the value of a whisper across a wire. Let's shift our attention to a man whose name should be shouted from rooftops, but instead barely makes it into footnotes. Alessandro Volta, the inventor of the electric battery. Now you've probably heard the word volt, maybe from science class, maybe from a battery pack, maybe from the back of your TV remote when you finally flip it over to see what's wrong. That volt comes directly from volt, as in Alessandro Volt, the Italian physicist who invented the first true battery in 1800. And yet, when people talk about electricity, he somehow gets overshadowed by flashier names: Edison, Tesla, Franklin, even though none of their breakthroughs would have happened without his. Picture this. Late 18th century Europe. Everyone's obsessed with electricity, but nobody really understands it. They're rubbing amber, zapping frogs, and using metal rods in thunderstorms. Electricity is more mystery than science. Then comes Volta, calmly building a stack of alternating zinc and copper discs, separated by pieces of cloth, soaked in salt water. That's it. That's the invention. Simple, silent, and completely revolutionary. This stack became known as the voltaic pile, and it was the first device that could produce a steady, continuous flow of electricity. Not just a spark, not just a zap, but a sustained current. Before Volta, electricity was a one-trick pony. After Volta, it could be harnessed, studied, and used to power actual devices. It was the moment electricity stopped being a magic trick and became a tool. But here's the frustrating part. Volta didn't chase fame, so he didn't make headlines like Edison or showbiz moves like Tesla. He didn't electrocute animals to demonstrate power or make grand claims about lighting cities. He quietly gave the world a power source and then moved on to more experiments. He wasn't flashy, he was just right. Historians still argue how much credit Volta should get compared to earlier experimenters like Galvani. Luigi Galvani, in particular, thought electricity was some mysterious life force. He famously zapped dead frogs and watched their legs twitch. Volta thought that was nonsense. He believed the movement came from chemical reactions between metals, not some invisible spark of life. To prove it, he built a device that generated electricity without needing any frog legs at all. No animals were harmed in the making of his battery. The scientific world was stunned. Napoleon Bonaparte was so impressed that he invited Voltaire to Paris to demonstrate his invention personally. Voltaire went, stacked his little metal discs, and lit up the room, literally and figuratively. Napoleon even made him a count, but as impressive as that sounds, it didn't come with the kind of lasting public fame his work deserved. While Voltaire kept experimenting, others built on his design. His pile became the foundation of modern electrochemistry. Batteries got smaller, stronger, and more portable. Telegraphs, radios, phones, computers, all of them owe their existence to the basic principles he laid out. And every time someone invents a new device, what do we ask? How long does the battery last? Here's a fun and weird twist. While Voltaire's name became the unit of electrical potential, the volt most people who use the word daily have no idea who he was. It's become a background term, like watt or amp, disconnected from the man who started it all. And yes, Edison and Tesla later did amazing things with electricity, but only because Voltaire made electricity reliable. Without his pile, there's no circuit to power, no current to direct. He didn't just invent a battery, he invented the idea that electricity could be stored and delivered on demand. But even now, if you ask a room full of people who invented the light bulb, most will say Edison. Ask who invented the battery. Blank stares. Maybe a guess. Duracell. Tesla. It's almost like Voltaire disappeared from the story once he handed over the power supply. And that's a shame, because the man was brilliant, careful, and completely devoted to discovery. He was born in Como, Italy, and spent much of his life teaching, experimenting, and corresponding with the scientific world. He wasn't trying to be famous. He was trying to understand. That humility helped science, but it let history brush past him. Even stranger, there's no big Voltaire movie, no Netflix series, no historical drama starring a brooding actor stacking copper discs while dramatic music swells. Just statues in Italy, a few plaques, and a quiet whisper of his name in physics class. Meanwhile, his invention literally powers the world. Phones, cars, satellites, pacemakers, toothbrushes. It's hard to go a single day without using something that traces its roots back to Voltaire's pile. And for the record, Voltaire wasn't some joyless lab hermit. He was curious, sociable, and surprisingly forward-thinking. He saw the potential of what he'd built, and even hinted at future applications that wouldn't be realized until long after his death. But he also knew how fast science moves. He once said that discoveries are built like bricks, and that his job was to lay one of many. So next time your phone hits 1% and you reach for a charger, or your car blinks low battery, or your kid's toy suddenly needs double A's, think of Voltaire, not the app, not the brand, not the outlet, but the quiet man with a pile of metal discs and a world-changing idea. Because long before there were smartphones and electric vehicles and portable power banks, there was just zinc, copper, salt water, and one very patient scientist. And from that stack came everything. Maybe it's time we charged up his legacy too. Let's rewind to a story that's somehow both brutal and heartwarming. Lady Mary Wortley, Montagu, the woman who helped bring smallpox inoculation to Europe and basically saved millions of lives, but didn't get the credit. Because of course she did. Born in 1689 into British aristocracy, Lady Mary wasn't supposed to be a medical pioneer. She was supposed to marry well, host elegant dinners, and maybe write the occasional poem. But smallpox didn't care about any of that. It disfigured her face when she caught it in her 20s and killed her brother. This wasn't some rare disease. It was the disease, wiping out people across Europe and leaving survivors permanently scarred. A few years later, Lady Mary followed her husband to Constantinople, now Istanbul, where he'd been appointed ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And here's where things get interesting. While there, she discovered something shocking. Ottoman doctors and women in local communities were performing a technique called variolation. They would take a small amount of pus from a mild smallpox case, scratch it into a healthy person's arm, and give them a controlled version of the disease, one they almost always survived. Afterward, they were immune. Let's pause here. This was the early 1700s. Germ theory didn't exist yet. Most European doctors thought disease was caused by bad smells or misaligned body fluids. Meanwhile, these women in Turkey were practicing a form of immunology centuries ahead of modern science. Lady Mary didn't just witness this, she believed in it, so much that she had her own son inoculated right there in Constantinople. She wasn't playing around. When she returned to England, she brought the practice with her and tried to spread the word. People thought she was insane, deliberately infect someone. Unthinkable. They mocked her, called her reckless, said it was unladylike to dabble in medicine. Some even said she was endangering her child, but she didn't stop. She hosted demonstrations. She got doctors to observe inoculations. She even had her daughter inoculated publicly in front of the royal court. Slowly, very slowly, attitudes began to shift. And yet, when British medicine finally embraced the idea, Lady Mary got almost zero recognition. Instead, a man named Edward Jenner came along nearly 80 years later with a similar but improved method using cowpox. Jenner's version was safer, more consistent, and didn't involve actual smallpox material. It became the foundation of vaccination as we know it. And Jenner, he got statues, textbooks, museums. But Lady Mary, she's rarely even mentioned as part of the story. Historians still argue whether Jenner knew about her work. Some say he did, some say he reinvented the wheel. Either way, it's clear that she brought the idea of immunization to Europe first. But because she wasn't a doctor, because she was a woman, history filed her under eccentric noblewoman instead of public health pioneer. Here's something weird and a little wonderful. Even though the medical establishment ignored her, parents didn't. Word spread through households, especially among mothers, that there was a way to protect children from the horror of smallpox. The idea Lady Mary carried from Istanbul started to take root, not through universities or medical journals, but through kitchens, nurseries, and whispers between neighbors. And that's maybe the most powerful part of her story. She didn't just invent a tool, she changed people's minds. At a time when women weren't even supposed to speak publicly about science, she made people listen, not because of her title, but because of her courage. She once wrote, "I am patriot enough to take the pains to bring this useful invention into fashion in England." And she did. Quietly, stubbornly, with no degree, no lab coat, and no applause. Today we talk about vaccines as one of the greatest achievements of modern science. And they are, but tucked behind every needle, every immunization chart, and every saved life, is the story of a woman who got there first, with no permission, no recognition, and no time to wait. So next time someone says Edward Jenner saved the world, maybe add a quick, yes, and Lady Mary Wortley Montagu lit the fuse. Because long before medicine caught up, she was already in the waiting room, rolling up her child's sleeve. Let's shift gears to something invisible, but absolutely essential. Wireless communication, and the man who helped make it all possible. Dr. Jaap Hartson. You've never heard his name, probably, but you use his work every day. Literally every single day. He's the guy behind Bluetooth. Yes, that Bluetooth. The thing you use to pair your headphones, your car, your keyboard, your smartwatch, your toothbrush. If you're fancy, it's become so common that the word itself barely means anything anymore. But when you dig into how it was created and who made it happen, you'll find Dr. Hartson quietly working at Ericsson in the 1990s, laying down the foundation for wireless short-range data transfer. The 90s weren't exactly wireless friendly. If you wanted your devices to connect, you needed ports, plugs, adapters, the size of bricks, and a whole lot of patience. Everything was wired, tangled, and frustrating. Companies knew they needed something better, but no one had figured it out until Jaap Hartson got to work. While at Ericsson, he was tasked with designing a low-power, low-cost method of connecting devices wirelessly over short distances. Sounds simple now, But it wasn't. Wi-Fi was still clunky and power-hungry. Infrared required direct line of sight and felt like a 1998 Star Trek prop. Hartson's breakthrough was using the 2.4 GHz radio frequency range, an unlicensed, globally available frequency, and creating a smart protocol that let devices talk to each other seamlessly. By 1998, the basic system was working. It was sleek, efficient, and adaptable. The marketing team named it Bluetooth, after a 10th century Viking king, Harald Bluetooth, who united Denmark and Norway. The name was meant to signal how this technology could unite different devices. It caught on, then it exploded. Bluetooth became a universal standard. It moved from Ericsson phones to everything: headsets, laptops, consoles, speakers, cars, and over time, it became so integrated into daily life that people stopped thinking about how it worked or who made it possible. It just became another feature. And that's the strange twist in Hartson's story. He invented something that changed the world, and then quietly faded from the public eye. You won't see his face at product launches, no YouTube montages, no tech documentaries opening with his name. Yet he gave the world one of the most widely used technologies on the planet. Historians still debate whether Hartson should be seen as the sole inventor of Bluetooth. Because, like most tech breakthroughs, it was a team effort. Others helped to develop the software, the user interface, the hardware integrations. But without Jupp Hartson's original protocol, there is no Bluetooth. And unlike many tech giants who get credit for simply buying patents, Hartson built his from scratch. Here's a quirky little fact. Hartson didn't chase fame, and he didn't cash out with a big startup IPO. Instead, he became a professor in the Netherlands, continuing to work on wireless tech, teach students, and stay miles away from the corporate spotlight. In 2015, he was finally inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. But again, how many people even know that? It's wild. We'll name a coffee drink after a TikTok influencer, but we won't remember the man who made it possible to sync our playlists to our headphones without untangling 5 feet of cable. Every time your phone automatically connects to your car, every time your smartwatch buzzes with a notification, every time your earbuds just work, it's Hartson's legacy in action. And the magic of Bluetooth is that it's invisible, quiet. It slips into your day without asking questions, just like its inventor. So next time you hear that satisfying little connected chime, take a second to remember Dr. Jupp Hartson, the man who made wireless feel effortless, the man who got your phone to talk to your speaker to talk to your laptop, and your laptop to talk to your TV, and the man who somehow built all of that and barely got a whisper of thanks. Let's talk about someone who probably touched your life before you even opened your eyes this morning. E.A. Johnson, the man behind the very first capacitive touchscreen. That's right, the technology that lets you tap, swipe, and zoom on your phone. The one you probably used to hit play on this video. That started with Johnson, not Steve Jobs, not Bill Gates, not some mysterious Silicon Valley startup. A British engineer working quietly in the 1960s, long before anyone was talking about tablets, smartphones, or pinch to zoom. Back then, computers were massive, boxy things, usually tucked away in labs or government buildings. They weren't personal, and they definitely weren't friendly. Johnson worked at the Royal Radar Establishment in Malvern, England, where most of his job involved radar displays and air traffic systems. But he had a problem. Too many knobs and switches. It was clunky, slow, and too easy to make mistakes in high-pressure environments. So he asked a question no one else really had yet. What if we could just touch the screen? That simple, brilliant idea led him to develop the first system that could detect the presence and location of a finger using the natural electrical charge in human skin. In 1965, he published a paper outlining the theory behind it. By 1967, he had built a working capacitive touchscreen prototype. It worked reliably. It responded to a human finger. It looked shockingly like the technology we use now. And yet, almost no one talks about him. When people think of touchscreens, they usually think of the iPhone. But that came out in 2007. Johnson's work happened 40 years earlier. Even earlier resistive touchscreen models used in ATMs or early handheld devices, owe a huge debt to his original idea. Historians still argue how directly modern capacitive screens descend from Johnson's model. Some say his work was more proof of concept than ready to market. Others argue that his system was so far ahead of its time that the tech industry simply wasn't ready to build on it. What's not up for debate is this: he invented it first, so why don't we know his name? Part of the answer is timing. Johnson wasn't in Silicon Valley. He wasn't a flashy tech founder. He didn't build a company around the idea or slap his name on every new device. He published his findings in a scientific journal, demonstrated the working prototype, and then moved on. He kept working in radar, defense systems, and eventually went into academia. He never pushed his invention into the commercial space. Then came the decades of slow catch-up. In the 1980s, companies began experimenting with resistive touchscreens, less sensitive, more pressure-based. These were used in things like grocery store checkouts and PDAs. Still, Johnson's capacitive idea hovered in the background, waiting for hardware and software to finally catch up. And when it did, the world exploded with smartphones, tablets, kiosks, smartwatches, and more. Your car dashboard, your fridge, your airplane seat back, all capacitive, all based on the idea Johnson had while trying to simplify radar screens. Here's a weird little tidbit. Capacitive touchscreens only work with conductive material, like your finger. That's why you can't tap your phone while wearing gloves. And that's why for a while we all looked like weirdos licking our fingers in the winter just to skip a song. All because Johnson's design was too good to ignore the physics. But despite building the foundation for how we interact with technology today, Johnson remains mostly forgotten. You won't see his name in documentaries. There are no TED Talks about him, no Apple keynotes giving him a nod. He didn't invent a device. He invented a language, the way we communicate with machines using just our fingertips. And still no one says, hey, shout out to Johnson for making scrolling Twitter at 2 a.m. possible. So next time you unlock your phone with a tap, or swipe through your photos, or pinch to zoom on a meme, think of E.A. Johnson, the man who turned glass into a portal, who made your hands into the keyboard, who wrote the first sentence of the touchscreen era, and then quietly left the room. Tonight, let's meet someone who helped build the digital world before we even knew what a digital world was. Douglas Engelbart, the man who invented the computer mouse. Now think about how natural it feels to move a little pointer around your screen. Click here, drag that, double-click this. It's second nature. But before Engelbart, computers were these intimidating things you interacted with using code, switches, or punch cards. They were more like vending machines than tools. And he looked at that and thought, nope, this should feel like an extension of your hand. Engelbart built the very first mouse in the 1960s. And it was, get ready for it, a small wooden box with 2 wheels and a single button. Not exactly sleek, but it worked. The wheels tracked movement along X and Y axes, letting users point to things on a screen instead of typing in commands. He called it an XY position indicator. Not the catchiest name, which might be part of why someone else later took all the glory. But Engelbart's real moment came in 1968, during an event that's now called the mother of all demos. He showed off not just the mouse, but video conferencing, hypertext, Windows, word processing, collaborative document editing, all in one live demo. Imagine showing the future of computing in one 90-minute presentation. People were stunned. Most didn't even understand what they were looking at. Historians still argue why Engelbart didn't become a tech rock star. Some say his ideas were too far ahead of their time. Others point out he wasn't focused on profit or flashy products. He wanted to augment human intellect. That was his phrase. Not make a cool gadget, not disrupt the market. Just quietly and powerfully help people think better, work better, live better. Meanwhile, the companies he inspired, Xerox PARC, Apple, Microsoft, took those ideas and turned them into household names. Steve Jobs famously saw a version of Engelbart's mouse at Xerox, refined it, and put it in the first Macintosh. Apple got the spotlight. Engelbart got a passing mention. Here's a quirky twist. Engelbart didn't even get rich off the mouse. The patent was owned by his employer, SRI International, and it expired before the device ever took off commercially. By the time the mouse was standard equipment, his name had already started to fade. But without Engelbart, you're still typing code to open a folder. There's no dragging, no dropping, no right-clicking. He didn't just make computing easier, he made it intuitive. He brought the human body into the conversation, using movement and motion to tell machines what we want. And yet, ask 10 people who invented the mouse. Most will shrug. Some might say Jobs or Gates. Engelbart is the ghost in the machine. Everywhere, but unnamed. He kept working on human-computer interaction for decades. He was passionate about using computers to solve global problems and increase collective intelligence. He wasn't chasing gadget sales or IPOs. He believed that tools should empower people to think collaboratively, creatively, and compassionately. Not exactly the marketing pitch that fits on a billboard. And while he did get recognition later in life, awards, honorary degrees, the Turing Award, it all came after the technology had already changed the world. Like so many quiet inventors, he watched others take the stage while his own moment passed by. So next time you sit down at your computer, move your mouse, open a window, and start a project, think about Douglas Engelbart, the man who saw what computers could be, not just boxes that beep, but partners in our thinking, the man who built the tools, gave them away, and quietly changed the way we work, learn, and connect. And the man who asked not what can this machine do, but what can we do if it helps. Let's spend a moment with someone who changed the way we light the world, Sir Hiram Maxim. And no, this isn't déjà vu. We're not talking about his early light bulb again. We're talking about the first fully automatic machine gun, the one he actually did become known for. Maxim's machine gun wasn't just a cool invention. It was a weapon that redefined warfare, one of the earliest tools of industrialized killing. Before his design, guns had to be reloaded manually. Soldiers fired single shots, then stopped to reload. Maxim's gun, pull the trigger, and it keeps firing. As long as you've got ammo, it keeps going. Cold, fast, mechanical. It worked using the recoil energy from one bullet to load the next. That's what made it automatic. It didn't need a second person, didn't need a crank, just a single gunner and a belt of bullets. Brutal efficiency, that's the word that stuck. The story goes that someone once told Maxim, if you want to make real money, invent something that will help these Europeans kill each other more easily. And, well, he did. In the late 1800s, the Maxim gun was adopted by armies all over the world. The British used it to maintain colonial control. It was used in African campaigns, in World War I, even in training exercises long after more advanced weapons had been invented. The image of 4 men crouched behind a mounted gun, surrounded by belts of ammunition, that was the Maxim gun. His name was Sir Hiram Maxim. Sounds like a Bond villain, right? But nope, this guy was a real inventor. Born in 1840 in Maine, grew up tinkering with machines, and moved to London in his 40s. He was full of energy, ideas, and probably more than a little ego. And one of those ideas, the electric light bulb. Now, if you ask most people who invented the light bulb, they'll say Thomas Edison without blinking. He's got schools named after him, movies referencing him, even an electric car company that borrowed his vibe. But Edison wasn't first, not by a long shot. In 1878, Maxim had already built a working incandescent lamp. It used carbon filaments, ran on electricity, and gave off a warm, steady glow. He filed a patent and went to work on mass production. But he didn't stop there. He also invented a fire sprinkler, a hair-curling iron, a type of inhaler for asthma, and oh yeah, the first fully automatic machine gun. Because sure, why not? But here's the catch. Maxim wasn't great at self-promotion. He was brilliant, but not flashy. He wanted the light bulb to work for factories and homes, not just for headlines. And while he was refining his designs and trying to make things reliable, Edison was doing something else. Making noise. Edison was a showman. He knew how to play the press, how to file flashy patents, and how to slap his name on things even if other people helped invent them. So when he finally revealed his light bulb in 1879, a year after Maxim's version, it didn't matter. The story was already being written, and Edison made sure he was the headline. Historians still argue whether Edison actually stole Maxim's ideas, or if they were just working in the same space at the same time. But what's clear is that Maxim got pushed out of the spotlight, even though he'd arrived first. Here's a fun and slightly sad twist. After all the drama, Maxim kind of gave up on the whole light bulb business. He sold his patents, he stopped talking about it, and instead, he focused on something else, something darker. He built the Maxim gun, the first automatic weapon used in modern warfare. It fired bullets faster than anything anyone had ever seen. It was terrifying. It changed the way battles were fought. And unlike his light bulb, this invention didn't get ignored. In fact, the Maxim gun became a symbol of European colonial power. There was even a brutal little saying at the time, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not." That's right, he didn't get famous for lighting up rooms. He got famous for mowing down enemies. But weirdly, even that didn't make him a household name. Not really. Today, if you ask around, most people have never heard of Hiram Maxim. No movies, no textbooks, no cool museums in his honor. Yet you can thank him every time you flip on a light, or dread his legacy every time a war documentary rolls out old footage of the First World War. He was a man who lit up the world, and then watched it burn. And somehow, we forgot to tell his story. Not anymore. The next name in our quietly forgotten Hall of Fame is Brahmagupta, a 7th century Indian mathematician who basically gave the world the number 0. And not just the concept, like nothing exists, but the actual usable digit, 0, that powers everything from rocket launches to restaurant bills. Now, when most people talk about the number 0, they say stuff like, "It came from India," and move on. It's a quick credit line, like the fine print in a contract. But Brahmagupta was more than just a name behind a numeral. He didn't stumble onto 0. He built it. He made rules for how to use it in calculations. He showed how it interacts with other numbers. And he did it all at a time when people thought math was more about mysticism than multiplication. Brahmagupta lived in a time when using 0 as a number, not just a placeholder, was basically unthinkable in many parts of the world. The Greeks hated it. The Romans didn't even have it. Try doing long division with Roman numerals and no 0. Go ahead, we'll wait. He was working at the Ujjain Observatory in central India, one of the oldest and most respected centers of learning in the world. There, around the year 628 CE, he wrote a book called Brahmasfuta Siddhanta, bit of a mouthful. But in it, he dropped the bombshell. When 0 is added to a number or subtracted from a number, the number remains unchanged. That may sound like preschool stuff now, but back then, revolution. He even tackled dividing by 0, which is still a weird and uncomfortable subject in most classrooms. His answer was a little off. He said it equals 0. But hey, we'll cut him some slack. He was centuries ahead of the curve. This wasn't just abstract math. His ideas helped lay the foundation for algebra, astronomy, engineering, and eventually computers. Every time your calculator doesn't melt when you subtract 0, you're seeing his legacy in action. And yet, outside of India, Brahmagupta barely shows up in the narrative. He's not on the posters in math classrooms. There are no Hollywood biopics about his lonely battle for numerical enlightenment. Instead, most people have vaguely heard that Arabs invented 0, which is only sort of true. Arab mathematicians helped spread it west, yes, but they got it from Brahmagupta's writings. Historians still argue whether Brahmagupta fully understood the abstract power of 0 the way modern math does. Some think he treated it too much like a regular number. Others say he was way ahead of his time. Either way, he didn't get the standing ovation. By the time Europe finally caught up, centuries later, his name had faded behind the Arabic translations of his work and the Western minds who popularized them. It's kind of like being the first person to invent a song, only for someone else to remix it, release it, and win the Grammy. Brahmagupta's song was Zero, and the world danced to it without learning who wrote it. Here's a quirky little detail about the man himself. He wasn't just a number nerd, he also dabbled in philosophy, religion, and astronomy. He believed the Earth rotated on its axis, and he calculated the length of the solar year with pretty remarkable accuracy. He was the kind of person who'd write equations in the morning and ponder the nature of existence by night. Total multitasker. In modern India, he's celebrated. There are awards in his name, and his face sometimes pops up in textbooks. But globally, it's like he dropped the most powerful concept in math and then quietly left the party before anyone could offer him a slice of cake. Meanwhile, we name tech startups, sports teams, and superheroes after anything that sounds vaguely Greco-Roman. We plaster Einstein's face on everything. And poor Brahmagupta, the man who gave us nothing, doesn't even get a thank you tweet. It's one of those cruel little twists in history. We build entire civilizations on someone's work, and then forget to keep their name on the foundation stone. But it's not too late to fix that. So next time you write a zero, maybe spare a moment for the man who turned nothing into everything. Let's talk about William Addis, the man who invented the modern toothbrush while sitting in a jail cell. That's right. The reason your dentist isn't crying every time you walk in is because some guy in 18th century England got arrested, stared at a filthy rag on a stick, and thought, we can do better than this. It's 1770, and Addis is locked up for starting a riot. Nothing massive, just a little protest that got out of hand. But while he's stuck behind bars, he notices that everyone's teeth are a mess. At the time, most people brushed their teeth with crushed shells, soot, or maybe just a cloth if they were fancy. Think rubbing your gums with gravel and sadness. So Addis does what any slightly unhinged, forward-thinking prisoner might do. He takes a small animal bone, left over from a meal, drills some holes into it, and threads in bristles made from brace-yourself pig hair. Sanitary, not especially, but it worked. It was the first version of the toothbrush we'd recognize today. When he got out of prison, he didn't just forget about it. He turned his little jail-time invention into a full-blown business. He started mass-producing toothbrushes in London and made a fortune. His company took off. And get this, the firm he founded kept running for 2 centuries. It eventually became Wisdom Toothbrushes, which still exists today in the UK. His idea, literally born behind bars, became a worldwide habit. But how many people know his name? Not many. Addis rarely shows up in museum displays, hygiene history books, or awkward dentist posters. Meanwhile, Listerine and Colgate get branded into our brains like corporate tattoos. Addis, not even a plaque. And yes, we see the irony. Historians still debate whether Addis truly invented the first toothbrush, or just refined existing ideas. The Chinese had versions with bristles centuries earlier, and people in the Middle East used chewing sticks like miswak. But Addis made it practical, he made it scalable, and he introduced it to a public that didn't yet think oral hygiene was important. Here's something oddly charming. He passed the business on to his son, and it stayed in the family for generations. By the 1800s, the Addis toothbrush was a standard in Britain. Not some noble invention passed down in golden boxes, just a piece of bone and bristles, sold by the dozen to regular people. What makes this story sting a little is how invisible he became in the grand scheme of things. No one learns about Addis in school. There's no National Toothbrush Day parade in his honor. In fact, you could argue that Addis is one of the most useful inventors in human history, and one of the most completely ignored. It's not glamorous. There's no electricity, no explosions, no high-speed innovation, just teeth. Just a jail cell, a leftover bone, and a guy who was tired of having morning breath strong enough to peel paint. Here's a weird little tidbit. Toothbrushes didn't become common in America until soldiers returned home from World War II. The military made toothbrushing mandatory, and the habit stuck, literally because of William Addis's basic design. His prison-born idea became global policy in the army, then crossed into everyday life. So the next time you reach for your toothbrush, fancy electric one, bamboo eco stick, or your dentist's freebie with the cartoon dolphin. Remember where it came from. Not from a lab, not from a university, from a riot, from a jail cell, from a man who looked at a stick with rag on it and thought, nope, this needs bristles. And then he changed your morning routine forever. Tonight's forgotten mind is Liang Lingzan, an 8th century Chinese astronomer, engineer and mechanical genius, who helped invent one of the most complex jaw-dropping devices the world had ever seen, the mechanical clock, a full 500 years before Europe even came close. Now, we tend to think of clocks as European inventions. You've got Big Ben, cuckoo clocks, sundials in Italian courtyards, all that. But the first fully documented, gear-driven mechanical clock wasn't made in Europe. It was built in Tang Dynasty China, in a time when most of the world was still counting hours by staring at the sun and squinting. Liang Lingzan, along with a Buddhist monk named Yi Xing, created an astronomical water-powered clock around 725 CE. It wasn't just a ticking box on a wall, it was an enormous jaw-dropping rotating sphere of the heavens. Imagine a globe covered in constellations that rotated perfectly to match the sky. Now imagine it was run by clever gear systems and flowing water, and you're getting close. And this wasn't just a science project. It had gears, levers, escapements, many of the core mechanisms that define modern mechanical clocks. It tracked the sun, moon, and even the movement of stars. It could chime at set intervals. It was a cosmic machine, showing the time, the heavens, and even the calendar. And it was sitting there, turning away silently in a royal observatory, while most of the world hadn't even figured out how to measure minutes. But who gets remembered? Usually a guy like Richard of Wallingford or Giovanni da Dondi, European names from centuries later. Liang Lingzan, meanwhile, is barely a footnote in most textbooks outside of China. You almost never hear his name in stories about timekeeping. It's like building a rocket ship and then getting forgotten because someone else flew it later. Historians still argue whether Liang and Yi Xing's clock counts as fully mechanical because it used water to power it. But here's the thing, the rest of the mechanism, the gears, the escapement systems, the clever regulation, was undeniably mechanical. Water was just the fuel, like electricity is for digital clocks today. And if you want something quirky, Liang didn't just stop at timekeeping. He was also deeply into astronomy and cosmology, using his invention to support what we'd now call scientific modeling. He wasn't building gadgets for fun. He was building machines that reflected how the universe worked. It was part science, part art, and part spiritual journey. That's the thing with Liang Lingzan. He didn't just build a machine to count hours. He built a machine that told the story of the sky, and still he barely got any spotlight. To make matters worse, the original clock didn't survive. Over the centuries, it was lost to war, decay, and time itself. Kind of cruel, given that it was made to track time. What we know of it comes from documents written by officials who described its design in detail. So while Europe was still ringing bells by hand, China had a star tracking machine with a built-in time display, and Liang was the mind behind it. And what happened to his legacy? Mostly silence. No monuments, no famous movies, no animated educational clocks named after him. He should be up there with Galileo and Newton, or at least hanging out in the same conversation. But no, he's just quietly orbiting history like one of the stars he tracked, visible only if you know where to look. It's strange how history treats invention. Sometimes you build a little device in your garage and become a household name. Other times you map the heavens with clockwork and get erased by the sands of time. So next time you check the time on your phone, your smartwatch, or even the microwave clock blinking the wrong hour, spare a thought for Liang Lingzan, the man who didn't just measure time. He gave it shape, he gave it motion, and somehow we let him fade into the background. Let's talk about Bai Sheng, the man who actually invented movable type printing 400 years before Gutenberg. You've probably heard that Johannes Gutenberg revolutionized printing in Europe during the 15th century. And yeah, he did. He made books easier to produce. Literacy shot up, and suddenly people could read the Bible without asking a priest first. Big deal. But what most people don't realize is that the basic idea behind the printing press wasn't his. Not even close. Bai Sheng was a Chinese inventor, living during the Song dynasty, around the year 1040. He wasn't a noble or a famous scholar, just a smart guy working in the background, while the rest of the world was still hand-copying manuscripts. Bai Sheng came up with something quietly genius: individual characters carved on tiny clay blocks that could be arranged, reused, and rearranged to print different pages over and over. In short, movable type. Let that sink in. A full 4 centuries before Europe figured it out, Bai Sheng was setting little ceramic letters into a tray, brushing ink on them, and pressing paper over the top. Mass production of text, right there. The invention was documented by another scholar named Shen Kuo in a book called Dream Pool Essays. So we know this isn't a legend or folktale, it's recorded history. Shen Kuo even described how Bai Sheng baked the clay to harden it, stored the characters in neat boxes, and could quickly rearrange them depending on what he needed to print. And yet, where's the credit? Today, Gutenberg has statues, museums, and even the title of most influential person of the millennium, according to some lists. Bai Sheng, not so much, unless you go digging into Chinese historical texts or niche printing history blogs, you'd never know he existed. Historians still argue whether Bai Sheng's invention had the same cultural impact as Gutenberg's. Some say that because Chinese script uses thousands of characters, unlike the relatively small Latin alphabet, movable type was less practical in China. Others argue that the invention's genius stands regardless of how widely it was adopted. Either way, he was first, and first counts. And here's something quirky. Centuries later, Korean printers started using movable metal type, also before Gutenberg. They took Bai Sheng's idea and upgraded the materials. Still no fame though. Gutenberg keeps the crown, largely because Europe had a bigger PR machine once the printing press exploded. It's not that Gutenberg doesn't deserve credit. His press really did change the world. But Bai Sheng should be in the same sentence. He imagined the entire idea breaking down language into reusable parts and using them to duplicate knowledge. That's revolutionary. That's world-shifting. And we barely mention him. Part of the reason is that Bai Sheng didn't promote himself. He didn't write a memoir or plaster his name on every scroll. He just did the work. After he died, his movable type tools were kept by his family. There's no surviving machine, no epic biography, just a short note in another man's essay that described a moment of quiet brilliance. But think about how much we owe him. Every time you hit copy and paste, every time you drag letters around on a screen, you're repeating his idea. Reuse, rearrange, reprint. The man invented modular thinking, and we let him disappear. So next time someone says Gutenberg changed the world, maybe add, yeah, but Bai Sheng lit the fuse. Because the story of printing doesn't begin in a German workshop. It starts in a Chinese kitchen, with clay, fire, and a man who saw letters not as sacred marks, but as tools you could move around. Now we turn to Ada Lovelace, often mentioned in passing as the first computer programmer, and then weirdly left out of almost every deeper conversation about actual computing. Let's fix that. Born in 1815, she was the daughter of the famous poet Lord Byron. Her mother, determined to keep Ada from developing her father's flair for dramatic brooding, shoved her into the world of math and logic instead. Good move. Ada didn't just excel, she became obsessed with machines, patterns, and how numbers could describe far more than just measurements. Fast forward to her early 20s. She meets Charles Babbage, the inventor of the analytical engine, a machine so ahead of its time that no one even knew what to do with it. Most people looked at it and thought, cool gears, I guess. But Ada, she saw something else entirely. She understood that Babbage's machine wasn't just a calculator. It could, in theory, be programmed to do any kind of symbolic manipulation. In other words, she saw the potential for general-purpose computing. Over a century before the first actual computers were built, Babbage didn't even fully grasp what he'd made. Ada did. In 1843, She translated a paper by an Italian engineer about the analytical engine and then added her own footnotes. Except her footnotes ended up being longer than the original paper. And inside them was something extraordinary, a full-fledged algorithm written for the machine. That's right, she wrote code before computers. And not just any math. We're talking about complex calculations for energy conversion systems, rocket trajectories, and launching satellites into orbit. In a time before most computers could even fill a room, Annie Easley was one of the original human computers. She ran numbers by hand. She did it faster than most machines. And then, when actual computers came in, she learned to program them. One of her biggest contributions was working on the Centaur rocket project, a critical high-energy upper-stage rocket that eventually helped launch spacecraft to other planets. Her code helped determine flight paths, energy efficiency, and fuel distribution. Basically, she was making sure these rockets didn't miss their targets or explode on the way up. Still, her name rarely appears alongside the big ones. No parade, no statue, no astronaut quoting her from space. Historians still argue why Easley and others like her were left out of the mainstream narrative. Was it because she was a woman? Because she was black? Because she wasn't loud about her achievements? Probably a mix of all three. She worked through segregation, institutional bias, and a system that wasn't designed to see her, and still she rose. Here's something else. Annie Easley didn't just stay in the technical side of NASA. She was also an advocate. She worked to recruit more women and people of color into STEM fields. She served on diversity committees. She mentored others. She made sure that the ladder she climbed wasn't pulled up behind her. And let's not forget, this was at a time when NASA still had separate bathrooms for black employees. Easley had to walk past rooms she wasn't allowed in just to get to her desk. But she never quit, never stopped learning, never stopped contributing. Here's a quirky, inspiring detail. When she applied to college, she did so without a calculator, just a slide rule and determination. She later said, "I just have my brain, and that's enough." And it was. Yet even today, her name isn't widely known. Katherine Johnson got some long overdue recognition thanks to Hidden Figures, but Annie Easley, still mostly hidden. No biopic, no viral thread. And still, her work quietly powers the satellites that orbit the Earth, the probes we send to Mars, the algorithms that shape how we travel through space. So the next time you hear about a rocket launch, see a satellite image, or scroll through a GPS app that relies on orbital math, think of Annie Easley, the coder, the scientist, the pioneer who helped put rockets in space and equality on the agenda, and the woman who proved again and again that brilliance doesn't always wear a badge, it just gets to work. Let's talk about someone who revolutionized sound and then got nearly erased from the story, Elisha Gray, the man who invented a working telephone at the exact same time as Alexander Graham Bell and still lost the race. The year was 1876. Two inventors, Bell and Gray, were racing to patent a device that could send a person's voice through wires. Not just clicks or taps like Morse code, but actual spoken words. Gray had already built a working prototype. He knew it worked. He submitted a patent caveat, basically a placeholder saying, "I'm about to file a full patent." He submitted it on the exact same day Bell filed his full application. And Bell? His patent got processed first. By just a few hours, that timing changed everything. Bell got credit. Bell got fame. Bell got rich. Gray? He got confusion, some suspicion, and then obscurity. Historians still argue over what really happened that day. Some believe that someone in the patent office may have shown Gray's caveat to Bell, or his lawyers. There's no smoking gun, but it's hard to ignore the fact that Bell's patent filed a few hours later suddenly described a system remarkably similar to Gray's. Coincidence? Maybe. Maybe not. What we do know is that Gray had a functioning liquid transmitter. His device converted sound into electrical signals and back again, just like Bell's. He was a respected inventor with multiple patents under his belt. He knew what he was doing. But instead of pushing for a legal battle, Gray backed off. His company wasn't eager to fight the case. And Bell, with his financial backers, pressed forward, and that was it. Bell's name got etched into every textbook. Gray's faded away. Here's a quirky detail. Elisha Gray also invented the electromagnetic musical synthesizer in 1876, the same year as the telephone mess. That's right, he created the first electronic music instrument before the electric guitar or any kind of synth even existed. He called it the musical telegraph. It could play tones through wires using oscillating electromagnetic circuits. If he'd leaned into music instead of telephony, who knows? Maybe we'd call him the godfather of electronic music instead. But again, Gray didn't chase the spotlight. He didn't sue Bell, even though he had a strong case. He didn't spend his later years shouting into the void. He just kept inventing quietly. That's the recurring theme here, right? Brilliant people, world-changing ideas, and then poof, they get outmaneuvered, outshouted, or just plain out-timed. And yet you can't erase the core truth. Gray's invention worked. His telephone could have become the telephone. His voice could have been the one saying, "Mr. Watson, come here." But it wasn't. Timing and paperwork, two things that don't feel particularly scientific, decided who got the glory. And still, Gray's legacy ripples out. His work on telegraphy helped shape communication systems. His music synthesizer laid a foundation no one even recognized. Until decades later, he was one of those rare minds who stood at the crossroads of science, sound, and invention, and still ended up left behind. So the next time you make a call, or stream music, or hear someone say Bell invented the telephone, maybe pause for a second. And remember Elisha Gray, the man who spoke too soon, literally, whose wires worked, but whose timing didn't. What happens when an empire crumbles, but its identity lingers? Post-Empire Britain was a strange beast. It had lost its dominion over vast swaths of the world, but it hadn't quite lost the habit of empire. The 1960s and 70s were filled with nostalgic films, Union Jacks, and speeches about punching above our weight. The empire was gone, but Britishness was exported harder than ever. In many ways, the Commonwealth became the costume party version of the empire. Countries that had once been ruled now sent athletes to compete in friendly games. Heads of state gathered for summits that sounded important, but mostly resulted in warm handshakes and tepid communiques. The Queen was still head of the Commonwealth, even as member nations redefined themselves. Some kept her as monarch, others didn't. Britain politely nodded either way. Cultural exports replaced territorial control. James Bond, born in the Cold War but soaked in imperial fantasy, raced across exotic landscapes with a stiff drink and a license to kill. The Beatles toured the world with guitars instead of gunboats. The BBC broadcast news to millions across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Britishness became an aesthetic, polished, witty, lightly condescending. At the same time, real history didn't go anywhere. Migrants from former colonies arrived in greater numbers, especially from the Caribbean, South Asia, and parts of Africa. They brought with them food, music, religion, and experiences that didn't fit the imperial fairy tale. They faced racism, housing discrimination, and second-class status in the mother country they'd been taught to admire. The Windrush generation, named after the ship that brought hundreds of Caribbean migrants in 1948, would later become the subject of a national scandal. In the 2010s, it emerged that many had been wrongly detained or deported due to government policies targeting undocumented immigrants. They'd grown up believing they were British, because they were only to be told. Decades later, they weren't. Meanwhile, debates about empire began to shift. For most of the 20th century, British schools taught empire as a glorious adventure. Colonies were acquired, civilized, and reluctantly released. By the 1990s, this narrative began to fracture. Revisionist histories gained traction. Books, documentaries, and university syllabi started to explore the darker corners, the famines in India, the brutality in Kenya, the thefts in museums. Historians still argue how Britain should reckon with its imperial past. Some demand reparations. Others want apologies. Some claim the empire brought order and progress, while others point out that those came wrapped in bayonets. Public opinion remains divided, though younger generations are more likely to view the empire critically than their grandparents ever did. Quirky fact: the British Museum, one of the most visited institutions in the world, still houses thousands of artifacts taken from colonized nations, often without consent and occasionally with cannon fire. Every few years, a country like Nigeria or Greece asks for something back. Britain says no. It's like the empire's attic full of trophies carefully labeled, not quite returned. In the 21st century, Britain continues to wrestle with post-imperial identity. The Brexit vote in 2016 brought it into sharp focus. Supporters dreamed of global Britain, a renewed trading nation, free from EU bureaucracy. Critics called it imperial nostalgia dressed in business casual. The idea that Britain could recapture its global role without an empire was both ambitious and a little bit delusional. And yet, Britain does have influence, just not the kind it used to. It's a soft power heavyweight. English is the global lingua franca. British universities draw students from across the planet. The Premier League is beamed into homes from Nairobi to New Delhi, and curry, once dismissed as foreign food, is now considered a national dish. Still, shadows remain. Many British laws, systems and borders still shape former colonies, sometimes for better, often for worse. In India and Pakistan, the legacy of partition still bleeds. In Nigeria, the colonial era merging of ethnic groups into one state continues to strain national unity. In the Caribbean, economic dependence and debt are rooted in plantation economies shaped by slavery. And in Britain itself, the legacy of empire shows up everywhere. In street names, statues, syllabi, royal ceremonies. It's a past that's not quite past. Empire wasn't a phase. It was a structure, a mindset. And while the borders have faded, the blueprint remains etched in institutions, economies, even imaginations. So the question lingers: can a country that once ruled the world ever stop trying to act like it still does? Because for all its tea rituals, dramatic exits and ceremonial nostalgia, Britain hasn't entirely let go. It may no longer command an empire, but it hasn't quite left the building, either. Let's finish strong with Otis Boykin, an inventor whose work made modern electronics reliable, safe and life-saving, and yet his name barely makes a blip in most conversations about innovation. Born in Dallas, Texas in 1920, Boykin came of age during segregation and systemic barriers that made scientific careers especially tough for Black Americans. He dropped out of a graduate program at the Illinois Institute of Technology, not because he couldn't hack it, but because he couldn't afford the tuition. Still, he didn't quit learning. He kept experimenting, tinkering, building, and eventually, he changed everything. Boykin is best known for inventing a precision resistor, a tiny, reliable component that can control how electricity flows through a circuit. Sounds simple, but it's crucial. Every electronic device you've ever used relies on resistors to keep from frying itself. Before Boykin, many resistors were unstable, expensive, or too fragile for complex electronics. His design was cheap, consistent, and durable, even in extreme conditions. It didn't just make electronics more reliable, it made them possible on a global scale. This invention caught fire in the best way. His resistors were soon used in radios, televisions, IBM computers, guided missiles, and yes, pacemakers. The next time someone tells you an inventor saved lives, ask if their work is keeping literal human hearts beating every second of the day, because Boykin's does. And yet, how often do we hear his name in science class? In tech timelines, on lists of world changers, historians still argue how much credit Boykin received in his own lifetime. He held over 25 patents, but worked mostly behind the scenes. He was hired as a consultant, contributed quietly to big firms, and often didn't see his name in the press releases. He was brilliant, but not branded, quiet, not corporate. Here's a quirky detail. Boykin once designed a burglar-proof cash register. It didn't take off, but it shows his mindset. He wasn't just working on big industry problems. He was trying to solve everyday ones too, whether it was home security or medical devices. He wanted technology to work for people. Later in life, Boykin even tried to develop a chemical air filter system, and he kept inventing until his death in 1982. He never stopped building, never stopped improving, and yet, his legacy still flies under the radar. His work lives in millions of machines, in hospital rooms, in emergency rooms, in satellites, in servers. But his name isn't etched in the tech world's Mount Rushmore. So next time your phone charges safely, next time your pacemaker pings normally, next time your computer boots up without a puff of smoke, think of Otis Boykin, the resistor king, the life extender, the man who made sure our technology didn't just run, but ran safely, smartly, and for everyone. Now let's talk about Margaret Knight, a woman whose nickname was the female Edison, and whose inventions were so good, someone literally tried to steal them. Born in 1838 in Maine, Knight grew up in a working-class family and started working at a cotton mill as a kid. By the age of 12, she'd already built a safety device to prevent industrial accidents. That kind of thing would have made headlines if she'd been a man. But for Margaret, it was just her normal way of seeing the world. Spot a problem, fix it. Her most famous invention, the machine that made flat-bottomed paper bags. Sounds simple, right? But before her design, paper bags were shaped like envelopes. They were useless for groceries or anything bulky. Knight's machine folded, glued, and shaped the paper into something strong, practical, and stackable. It didn't just make packaging better, it helped shape the future of retail and storage. You've probably used 100 of these bags in your life, without ever thinking about where they came from. Now here's where the story gets ridiculous. While applying for a patent in 1871, Knight discovered that a man named Charles Annan had seen her machine and tried to patent the idea as his own. He thought no one would believe that a woman had invented something so precise and mechanical. That was literally his argument in court. But Knight wasn't having it. She fought back. She filed a lawsuit, presented detailed design drawings, models, and even witness testimony from the factory where she worked. She proved without question that the invention was hers, and she won. Historians still debate how close Annan came to stealing credit. What's not in question is how rare it was, in the 19th century, for a woman to not only invent a machine, but defend it publicly in a courtroom. Knight didn't just build the product, she built her legacy, piece by piece, and she kept inventing. She designed rotary engines, shoe-cutting machines, a window frame system, a dress shield, and more. She held over 25 patents, at a time when most women couldn't even open a bank account without a husband's signature. Knight was a one-woman R&D department, operating decades before gender equity in science was even considered a goal. Yet how often do we hear her name? We hear Edison, we hear Tesla, we even hear Jobs and Musk. But Margaret Knight? Mostly silent, maybe a mention on an International Women's Day slideshow, maybe a blip in a local newspaper archive. But no statues, no movies, no classroom posters. And that's a tragedy, because her work was everywhere. Grocery stores, department stores, hardware shops, all of them owe her a debt. Her invention helped shape the modern consumer experience. Here's a quirky, very Margaret Knight thing. She once said she'd rather be remembered as a mechanic than as a lady. Not because she didn't value being a woman, but because she wanted the work to matter more than the category. She didn't want to be exceptional for her gender, she wanted to be standard-setting for anyone. She died in 1914, still inventing, still sketching, still building. So the next time you grab a brown paper bag, stuff it with groceries, lunch, or odds and ends, think of Margaret Knight, the builder, the fighter, the woman who refused to let anyone fold her out of history, just because she built something better than they did. Now let's talk about Margaret Knight, a woman whose nickname was the female Edison, and whose inventions were so good, someone literally tried to steal them. Born in 1838 in Maine, Knight grew up in a working-class family and started working at a cotton mill as a kid. By the age of 12, she'd already built a safety device to prevent industrial accidents. That kind of thing would have made headlines if she'd been a man. But for Margaret, it was just her normal way of seeing the world. Spot a problem, fix it. Her most famous invention, the machine that made flat-bottomed paper bags. Sounds simple, right? But before her design, paper bags were shaped like envelopes. They were useless for groceries or anything bulky. Knight's machine folded, glued, and shaped the paper into something strong, practical, and stackable. It didn't just make packaging better, it helped shape the future of retail and storage. You've probably used 100 of these bags in your life without ever thinking about where they came from. Now here's where the story gets ridiculous. While applying for a patent in 1871, Knight discovered that a man named Charles Annan had seen her machine and tried to patent the idea as his own. He thought no one would believe that a woman had invented something so precise and mechanical. That was literally his argument in court. But Knight wasn't having it. She fought back. She filed a lawsuit, presented detailed design drawings, models, and even witness testimony from the factory where she worked. She proved, without question, that the invention was hers. And she won. Historians still debate how close Annan came to stealing credit. What's not in question is how rare it was, in the 19th century, for a woman to not only invent a machine, but defend it publicly in a courtroom. Knight didn't just build the product, she built her legacy, piece by piece, and she kept inventing. She designed rotary engines, shoe-cutting machines, a window frame system, a dress shield, and more. She held over 25 patents, at a time when most women couldn't even open a bank account without a husband's signature. Knight was a one-woman R&D department, operating decades before gender equity in science was even considered a goal. Yet how often do we hear her name? We hear Edison. We hear Tesla. We even hear Jobs and Musk. But Margaret Knight, mostly silent, maybe a mention on an International Women's Day slideshow, maybe a blip in a local newspaper archive. But no statues, no movies, no classroom posters. And that's a tragedy, because her work was everywhere. Grocery stores, department stores, hardware shops, all of them owe her a debt. Her invention helped shape the modern consumer experience. Here's a quirky, very Margaret Knight thing. She once said she'd rather be remembered as a mechanic than as a lady, not because she didn't value being a woman, but because she wanted the work to matter more than the category. She didn't want to be exceptional for her gender. She wanted to be standard setting for anyone. She died in 1914, still inventing, still sketching, still building. So the next time you grab a brown paper bag, stuff it with groceries, lunch, or odds and ends, think of Margaret Knight, the builder, the fighter, the woman who refused to let anyone fold her out of history, just because she built something better than they did. 4. You said, let's end with someone who didn't just imagine a smarter future, he literally gave it its brain. George Boole, the quiet genius who invented Boolean logic, the foundation of computer science, artificial intelligence, and basically every search bar you've ever used. Born in 1815 in England, Boole was entirely self-taught. His father was a cobbler with a love of science, and George inherited both the curiosity and the work ethic. By age 10, he was reading Latin. By 16, teaching himself calculus, and by his early 20s, he was asking a strange question for a math teacher. What if we could do algebra with truth? That question led him to write The Laws of Thought, a book in which he laid out a new kind of logic. In it, he suggested that ideas like true and false could be treated like numbers. You could add, subtract, multiply them. You could apply operations to abstract ideas. Sound dry? It's not, because what Boole invented was binary logic, the system of yes and no, on and off, 1 and 0, that powers every computer, search engine, and digital system on Earth. Still, most people don't know his name. You've probably used Boolean logic dozens of times this week without realizing it. Ever searched Google using and, or not? That's Boole. Set up filters in your inbox? Boole, code a function that checks if two things are true at once. Double Boole. Every time a computer makes a decision, it's using Boole's ones and zeros to figure it out. Historians still argue how aware Boole was of what he'd sparked. He died in 1864, long before computers or circuits. He never touched a keyboard, never saw a motherboard, never imagined search engines or AI, but his system made all of it possible. His work wasn't flashy, it wasn't mechanical, it didn't power a rocket or wire a city. It was abstract, and for decades, it was mostly seen as interesting, but impractical, philosophy with numbers. It wasn't until the 20th century, when people like Claude Shannon began applying Boolean algebra to electrical circuits, that the true impact hit. Suddenly, Boolean's quiet logic became the language of machines. And here's the thing. He wasn't trying to build a tech empire. He was trying to understand how we think. He believed there was a structure underneath reasoning, a pattern to human logic that could be written down, just like math. And he did it, cleanly, elegantly, and completely ahead of his time. But no movie has been made about George Boole. No biopic, no miniseries, no Boole Day on the tech calendar. We remember Turing, Jobs, Gates, but the man who taught computers how to think, mostly a mystery to the people whose lives he changed. Here's a quirky detail. Boole died because he insisted on staying true to his own logic. After getting caught in a storm, he lectured in wet clothes and caught pneumonia. His wife believed illness was caused by imbalance, so she treated him by pouring buckets of water on him. It didn't go well. And still, he changed the world. Quietly, fundamentally, irrevocably. So the next time you ask Siri a question, or search Google for two things at once, or write a line of code that says if this and that, think of George Boole, the teacher, the philosopher, the man who taught computers the difference between yes and no, and helped them turn that into everything. But while the weapon became infamous, Maxim didn't. Not really. If anything, his invention became a symbol of empire, of brutality, of progress without humanity. But the man who built it, he gets lost in the shadow of the thing itself. And here's what's strange. Maxim wasn't just a weapons guy. In fact, he hated war. He said on multiple occasions that he never intended for his invention to be used in such massive slaughter. He believed that such a deadly weapon would actually prevent war, that nations would be too afraid to fight. Classic inventor optimism. He also invented a fire sprinkler system, a hair-curling iron, and even a flying machine. He was fascinated by flight and built a huge prototype airplane before the Wright brothers ever took off. It didn't quite fly, but it was part of the journey. He was an all-around builder, electric lights, steam engines, mousetraps, and more. Historians still debate how much Maxim genuinely understood the consequences of his machine gun. Was he naive? Was he pragmatic? Did he really think it would bring peace? Either way, he was one of the first people to put a system behind violence, turning gunfire into something mechanical and uninterrupted. And while the gun changed the world, his name didn't. Ask most people what a Maxim is, and they might think of a fashion magazine. Few will say, oh, the inventor who changed warfare forever. There's something chilling in how his story gets told, or doesn't get told. His machine reshaped battlefields, and yet he became just another obscure footnote. Not quite hated, not quite celebrated, just forgotten in plain sight. Here's a quirky detail. He became a British citizen, was knighted by Queen Victoria, and even got into a public feud with Thomas Edison over who really invented the light bulb. Spoiler, it wasn't Edison either. Not entirely, but while Edison became a household name, Maxim faded, despite having arguably a much bigger real-world impact. He died in 1916, just as his invention was being used to mow down soldiers in the trenches of World War I. The gun that was supposed to prevent war became a symbol of its horrors. So the next time you see an image of a machine gun nest in a history book, or hear someone talk about automatic fire, think about Hiram Maxim, not just the inventor of a gun, but a man who believed he was making the world safer, even as his invention did the opposite. And a man who, for better or worse, pulled the trigger on a new kind of war. Let's take a moment for someone who revolutionized how we measure time, shaped how we live our lives, and then somehow got left out of most of the conversation. Benjamin Banneker. Born in 1731 to a free African-American family in Maryland, Banneker wasn't supposed to become an inventor. not in colonial America, not at a time when opportunities for black people were virtually non-existent. But Banneker didn't follow anyone's rules. He taught himself astronomy, math, and engineering from borrowed books and observation. And then he built something that stunned everyone around him, a working wooden clock, entirely from scratch. Let's be clear, this wasn't just whittling for fun. Banneker had never seen a clock mechanism up close. He'd only studied a borrowed pocket watch. But by the age of 22, he carved wooden gears, figured out gear ratios, and built a striking clock that kept time accurately for decades. No training, no mentorship. Just raw intelligence, curiosity, and craftsmanship. His clock was the first of its kind in the American colonies. People came from miles around to see it. It chimed on the hour and ran flawlessly. It's the kind of story that should be in every history book, every science class. But Banneker's name, still not widely known. And the clock was just the beginning. Banneker became deeply invested in astronomy. He calculated lunar and solar eclipses with stunning precision and published almanacs that predicted celestial events, tides, and weather, things essential to farmers and sailors. He did this during a time when most people of his background couldn't even attend school, and yet his almanacs were published and distributed widely in the late 1700s. George Washington himself received a copy. Historians still argue over just how much support he received behind the scenes. Did he work entirely alone? Was there help from abolitionist publishers? But no one disputes the fact that Banneker's contributions were significant, independently brilliant, and courageously public at a time when being a free black intellectual was dangerous. One of the most overlooked moments in his life happened in 1791. Banneker was hired to assist the surveying team that would lay out the plans for Washington, D.C. Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, the lead designer, walked off the job with all the plans halfway through the project. The story goes that Banneker had memorized the layouts and helped recreate the entire design from memory. No blueprints, no backups, just what he'd stored in his mind. It's the kind of mythic moment that would make a national hero out of anyone else. But Banneker's name doesn't roll off the tongue like Jefferson or Franklin. His face isn't on any currency, and yet he quite literally helped build the Capitol. Here's something quietly powerful. Banneker used his fame to fight for justice. He wrote a now famous letter to Thomas Jefferson, calling him out for his hypocrisy, writing about freedom while owning slaves. He respectfully challenged Jefferson's view of black intellectual ability, and enclosed a copy of his almanac as proof that yes, a black man could master science and math. Jefferson responded with vague praise, but of course, the system stayed the same. Banneker's clock was lost to time, most likely destroyed in a fire on the day of his funeral. A cruel final twist. But his writings, his calculations, and his courage survived. Still, despite all that, his name isn't on the shortlist of great American inventors. Schools gloss over him. Documentaries rarely mention him. It's like his story was filed away and quietly forgotten. Too inconvenient, too inspiring, too real. And that's the tragedy. Not that he didn't do enough to be remembered, but that he did everything and still wasn't. So next time you check your watch, glance at a calendar, or read the weather forecast, remember Benjamin Banneker, the clockmaker, the astronomer, the mathematician, and the man who, against all odds, measured the stars and reminded the world that genius doesn't follow skin color, status, or permission. Let's talk about someone whose invention probably lives in your pocket, sits on your desk, or maybe even hangs out on your wrist. Martin Cooper, the father of the mobile phone. And no, not in the he started a cool app kind of way. Martin Cooper made the first ever handheld cellular phone call. The reason we can walk around today talking, texting, or scrolling while ignoring perfectly good face-to-face conversations. The year was 1973. Bell Labs had been working on car phones, big clunky radios wired into vehicles. They were expensive, limited, and definitely not portable. But Martin Cooper, working at Motorola, had a bolder idea, a phone you could hold in your hand, one that didn't need to be tied to a car, a wall, or a backpack full of equipment. so he built it. The prototype was a beast by today's standards, about 10 inches tall, weighed over 2 pounds, and had a battery life of 30 minutes after 10 hours of charging. It looked like a walkie-talkie had eaten a brick, but it worked. And on April 3rd, 1973, standing on a sidewalk in New York City, Cooper made history by dialing up his rival at Bell Labs, just to rub it in. Can you imagine? "Hey Joel, this is Marty. I'm calling you from a real mobile phone, a handheld one." Mic drop. That moment changed everything. It proved that cellular communication could be personal, untethered, and truly mobile. And yet most people have no idea who Martin Cooper is. Instead, we associate the mobile revolution with companies, Apple, Nokia, Samsung, or modern CEOs. Cooper didn't build an empire. He built the starting line. Without him, none of it exists. Historians still debate who else deserves credit. There were whole teams working on cellular networks, base stations, frequency coordination, but Cooper is the face of that very first call, the person who took it from a lab concept to a street-level reality. And here's the wild part. He didn't stop with just making the call work. He had a vision. He imagined phones small enough to carry in your pocket. He believed they would one day free people from desks and walls. He wasn't just making a device, he was predicting a lifestyle. Sound familiar? Cooper once said that phones should be an extension of the person, and that idea now lives in every touchscreen, every selfie, every voice note. He was thinking ahead, not in years, but decades. And yet no one's making a movie about him. No documentaries, no best-selling biographies. He's occasionally interviewed on tech anniversaries, sometimes wheeled out for a remember when moment, but his name doesn't live in the cultural spotlight the way it should. Here's a fun, very human detail. Cooper didn't just work on phones. Earlier in his career, he helped develop Motorola's first handheld police radios. So if you've ever seen a cop in a movie yell into a shoulder-mounted mic, you're seeing his work again. And another quirk, when asked what he thinks about smartphones today, Cooper often says they're too complicated. Too many buttons. Too much screen time. He's not a fan of notifications ruling our lives. In other words, he gave us freedom, and now he watches us waste it staring at TikTok. But maybe that's the most powerful part of his story. He didn't want to be famous. He wanted to solve a problem. And he did, with a plastic box, a stubborn dream, and a little spite aimed at the competition. So next time your phone rings, or your GPS saves you from getting hopelessly lost, or your text message makes someone's day, take a moment to remember Martin Cooper, the man who cut the cord, who walked the streets of New York with a 10-inch phone brick, and who gave the world a new way to connect one pocket, one person, and one call at a time. Let's talk about Lewis Latimer, an inventor whose work made electric light practical, whose hands helped draft the future, and whose name somehow never made it into the glow of the spotlight. When we think about electric light, one name usually comes to mind: Thomas Edison. He's credited with inventing the light bulb, the phonograph, and 100 other gadgets. He was brilliant, no doubt. But Edison didn't work alone, and he wasn't even first. Dozens of inventors were racing to make a long-lasting electric light bulb. Among them was a man named Lewis Latimer, who not only improved the bulb, but also helped make it usable for everyday people. Latimer was born in 1848 in Massachusetts. His parents were formerly enslaved. His father actually escaped slavery and was one of the few to win his freedom in court. Lewis grew up in tough conditions, but he was brilliant. He taught himself mechanical drawing while working at a patent law firm, using scrap paper and watching others around him. Eventually, he became such a skilled draftsman that he was hired to draw the designs for Alexander Graham Bell's telephone patent. That alone should have made him famous. Bell's telephone sketch, that's Latimer's hand. But he didn't stop there. In the 1880s, while working for the US Electric Lighting Company, which was a rival to Edison's firm, Latimer made a major breakthrough: a longer-lasting carbon filament. You see, the early light bulbs burned out fast. They were dim, unreliable, and couldn't stay on long without dying. Latimer figured out a better material, and a better manufacturing process. Suddenly, the bulb lasted longer. It became something people could actually use in homes, offices, streets. And when Edison eventually brought Latimer into his own company, the Edison Electric Light Company, it was to help him defend his patents and continue refining lighting systems. Latimer wrote a book called Incandescent Electric Lighting in 1890. It was one of the first comprehensive guides on how the technology worked. In other words, he literally wrote the book on light bulbs. Historians still argue how much of Edison's success was built on Latimer's work. Edison had the name, the PR, the company. Latimer had the technical skills, the ideas and the drawings. But as usual, the spotlight leaned toward the louder figure. And because Latimer was black, his story got buried even deeper. At a time when racial discrimination was baked into every system, Latimer was out here filing patents, managing engineers, and installing electrical systems around the country. And yet, most people never hear about him. Here's a quirky little twist. He was also a poet. He loved language. He wrote about hope and humanity, and even composed verses about light and invention. Imagine that. The guy helping wire the world was also scribbling poems by candlelight. He was also one of the few black members of Edison's elite engineering group, known as the Edison Pioneers. But his name didn't make it into textbooks. No classroom posters, no glowing tributes. He gave the world a better light, and then lived in the shadow of someone else's fame. There's a photo of Latimer in his later years, sitting beside a window, staring calmly out. It's the face of a man who built the systems behind the scenes, never chasing headlines, just quietly making history. So the next time you flip a light switch, pause for a second. Think of Louis Latimer, the draftsman, the inventor, the poet who made the darkness a little more manageable for all of us, and the man who helped make electric light not just possible, but practical. Let's talk about someone who shaped the entire way we interact with money. Walter Hunt, the man who invented the safety pin, the sewing machine, and arguably changed how we buy, sell, and live, all without getting proper credit. Born in 1796 in New York, Hunt was a mechanic, an inventor, and the kind of person who saw a problem and instantly tried to fix it. He wasn't rich, he wasn't famous, but his brain just kept churning out solutions. One of his most iconic creations, the safety pin. It was 1849. Hunt owed a friend $15, so he sat down, fiddled with a piece of brass wire, and in 3 hours came up with a spring-loaded clasp that could fasten fabric without stabbing you. He patented it. Then, because he was broke, he sold the rights for $400 and walked away. The company that bought it made millions. Hunt got grocery money, but here's where things get truly wild. Hunt didn't stop at pins. In fact, years earlier, around 1833, he built the first practical sewing machine. This was a huge deal. People had been trying to invent a sewing machine for decades. Hunt's version used a curved needle with an eye at the point and a second thread looping from underneath. Sound familiar? That's because every modern sewing machine is based on this design. But Hunt was worried. He feared that if sewing machines became widespread, they would put seamstresses and tailors out of work. So instead of patenting it immediately, he shelved it. Years later, a man named Elias Howe filed a similar patent. There was a legal battle, and while it was eventually acknowledged that Hunt had built his machine first, he had no patent, no payday. Historians still argue whether Hunt's moral hesitation held back progress or reflected a rare kind of inventor's conscience. Either way, he didn't get rich, or famous, or remembered. He just kept inventing. His mind never stopped. He designed a street-sweeping machine, a nail-making device, a repeating rifle, a fountain pen, a flax spinner, a paper collar, a foot-operated saw, an early version of the Winchester repeating rifle, and most of them, he either never patented or sold for peanuts. He wasn't focused on business, he was focused on building. Here's the frustrating part. A lot of his inventions ended up making other people rich. The safety pin went global. The sewing machine changed industries. The firearms industry picked up his gun designs. His ideas were like seeds, and everywhere they landed, trees grew, but he didn't get to harvest any of it. No statues, no school books, no national day in his name. What makes Walter Hunt's story so bittersweet is how deeply woven his inventions are into daily life. Every jacket fastened, every buttonhole reinforced, every machine-stitched shirt owes something to him. But he's almost never mentioned. We remember brand names and patent holders, not the guy who sat down one day with a bent wire and a debt, and quietly changed the way people dressed. And it wasn't just about objects. Hunt's inventions saved time, saved labor, made things easier. He saw how regular people lived and tried to make their lives better, one odd little mechanism at a time. So the next time you pin a label, sew on a patch, or hear the hum of a sewing machine, spare a thought for Walter Hunt, the inventor, who was always ahead of the curve, who kept building in the background, and who, despite being behind some of the world's most useful objects, never quite got his name stitched into the fabric of history. Let's shine a light on Annie Easley, a brilliant mind who helped lay the foundation for modern spaceflight and computer science, and yet, like so many others, barely got a mention outside the footnotes of history books. Born in 1933 in Birmingham, Alabama, Annie Easley grew up in the Jim Crow South. She didn't let that stop her. She studied pharmacy at first, then pivoted completely when she read a newspaper article about opportunities at what was then called the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the precursor to NASA. She applied, got hired, and suddenly, she was doing math for rocket scientists.